Hey everyone, and welcome to this Social Europe video cast. My name is Robin Wilson, and our distinguished guest today is Paul de Beer, Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Amsterdam, and author of The Labour Market Myth, a just published, in English, challenge to the conventional wisdom about the contemporary world of work. Paul, and welcome.
Definitely.
In recent decades, the labour market in advanced capitalist societies has been repeatedly represented in these terms.
Yeah.
Unlike in a more predictable past, and spurred on by technological development and globalization, it has become a churning, dynamic arena with rapid job changes for individuals whose flexibility is a must in a 24/7 working environment of volatile hours. You say, however, that this truism is simply not true. What is your evidence for that?
Yeah, actually, I've been quite surprised about the almost self-evidence with which people claim that we are in a 24/7 economy and that people are changing jobs all the time, etc., etc. Because if you try to find figures about this, it doesn't seem to be that way. I think people are mainly influenced by the fact that there was an increase of so-called atypical labor relations, so flexible jobs, solo self-employed, temp work, etc. But if you look at figures, not very abundant figures, I have to say, about for example, the number of years that people are working in the same job, it turns out that that has hardly changed in the past decades. In general, in many countries, people on average have been working for the same company for, let's say, about 8 to 10 years. And today, that's not very different from the situation 10 or 20 years ago in most countries. So it's not true that people switch jobs more often than in the past, even though perhaps more people have an atypical contract than they used to have in the past. And with respect to the 24/7 economy, well, there are only a few countries which have reliable figures on the hours of the day and the days of the week on which people are working. For example, the Netherlands has those figures, the United States has those figures. And if you then calculate which percentage of the time people work outside the normal office hours. So let's say Monday to Friday between 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. Then it turns out that the percentage is rather low, in the order of 15% of the total time, and it has not increased over time. So it's not true that people are more working in the evenings or in nights or in the weekends than in the past.
You introduced your book, Paul, with the remark that a founding principle of the International Labour Organization was that, quote, labour is not a commodity, unquote. Yet the standard labour market model conceives of the working world as the aggregate of myriad price-focused exchanges between individual buyers and sellers of labour. What is wrong with that theoretical approach?
Yeah, let me state clear from the start that I'm not claiming that there is not something like supply and demand of labor which interact with each other. Of course it is. There are people who want to work, there are employers who are looking for workers, and we are seeking a match between supply and demand. But the essential element of the standard labor market model is that allocation from workers to jobs is realized through the price mechanism. People react to financial incentives, companies react to financial incentives, and therefore it's the price of labor, or in other words, the wage rate, which determines which people are hired and which jobs people choose to apply for. And my criticism is that people do not react primarily on those financial incentives, but that there are many other reasons why people are looking for a particular job. So if people switch jobs, I already said that doesn't happen as often as is often assumed, but of course, people do change jobs. The main reason is not that they can earn more in another job, but primarily that they like the other job more, that it's a more interesting job, that they have more career prospects and things like that. So it's not primarily the financial incentive which motivates people to work and to change jobs, but that are more the so-called intrinsic aspects. And those intrinsic aspects of work are fully neglected in the standard labor market model.
Yes, I want to that point about intrinsic motivations. It's a very interesting point, Paul. Connecting my first two questions, then, you point out that much labor market policy in recent times has been driven by the idea that so-called rigidities in the real world should be removed so that it more accurately reflects the theory. What have been some of the consequences of this in practice?
Well, actually, many governments have tried in the past 10 or 20 years to approach more closely the model of the labor markets as you can find it in the economic textbooks. And it means that they have been indeed promoting more flexibility, more mobility, more dynamism on the labor market. And ways to accomplish that, there are very many ways, but for example, governments have in many countries relaxed the employment protection legislation, especially for people on a permanent contract. They've created more room for flexible contracts, temporary contracts, etc. Also, for example, in the Netherlands, there has been much more opportunities for solo self-employed who have no labor contract at all. There have been many measures focused on benefit recipients who have been given more financial incentives to move to the labor market, to accept jobs, and so on. So in general, the idea was, which was also, by the way, promoted, for example, by the European Union, but also by the OECD, they have tried to promote a more flexible, a more dynamic labor market in hoping that in that way the labor market would function better.
Orthodox economics indeed claims, as you imply, Paul, that unlimited markets will achieve so-called racial optima, that is, aggregate outcomes which cannot be improved upon. In your terms, however, these are not necessarily fair outcomes. For example, they may be very unequal or the best for the long run. For instance, when it comes to investing in training. So what would be the policies you would endorse in this arena to achieve fair results for all?
Yes, to return to my previous answer on the kind of policies that have been implemented in order to create a more flexible labor market, consequences have been, of course, a reduction of security. People are no longer secure in the job. They have a bigger risk of being dismissed, for example, or benefits recipients who have often experienced a cut in their benefit level to, or in the hope that they would more easily find a job. The consequence, if this does not work, is not so much that people become more secure, but as would be the case if the labor market would function well, but that they become less secure because they run more risk of losing a job. And for example, benefit recipients may experience a lower benefit level than, or a shorter duration of the benefits than happened in the past. So my advice would be simply to turn this back to the way it used to be. Actually, you might say the old-fashioned welfare state from the, let's say, post-war period, which has been much criticized because it would be detrimental to a well-functioning labor market, actually, in my view, was not that detrimental at all and guaranteed a lot of security. So there should be more emphasis, in my view, on stability, on security, on protection of workers, and not strong emphasis on trying to stimulate them to move to other jobs, to accept a lower benefit and things like that.
Well, of course, it's been hundreds and famous from the political process as bringing about decommodification of labor, and that brings me to my final question, Paul, which is that if in line with what you say, you believe that labour should not be treated as a commodity. Then you say the focus should shift to considering employment as a relationship, and as you said a few minutes ago, and to the intrinsic motivation workers prioritise in surveys over extrinsic benefits such as pay. So then the idea is not endless churning, in which a worker's only option is exit to another purchaser of their labour, but stability and employment, as you just said, associated with individual and collective voice. What does all that mean in practice?
Well, it's interesting that you just refer to Espen Andersen, because his famous book on the free worlds of welfare capitalism showed that in those countries which offer the most protection to workers and to the population in general, mainly the Nordic countries, also performed best in terms of the labor market, had the highest employment rate, the lowest long-term unemployment rate. So actually he showed that there is no contradiction between a generous welfare state and protection of workers on the one hand, and a well-functioning labor market on the other hand. But apparently that idea has been forgotten by most politicians, even by many politicians in the Nordic countries, which also have cut benefit levels and have a less generous welfare state than they had in the past. And I think we should simply focus on that old idea. You can offer people protection, you can offer them security, you can make it difficult for companies, for example, to dismiss workers. And the consequence of that will be that both workers and employers have a strong incentive to invest in their relationship. Because if it's not easy to fire someone, then a company has an interest in investing, for example, in training or further education of the workers in order to keep them, to make sure that the productivity does not decline. And workers, of course, if they know that if they stay in a company, they can develop further, they can indeed get training. They will also indeed see an improvement of their pay, although that may not be the most important motivation. Nevertheless, it can help in stimulating them to also invest in your relationship. So a durable relationship between company and worker is in the long term in the best interest of both the company and the worker. And that should be, in my idea, the main focus. And it would actually mean that people move onto the labor market only in perhaps a few times during their whole career. Most people do not change jobs more often than 3 or 4 times during their whole career. So most of the time, you actually are not operating on the labor market, but you're operating within a company on the what's sometimes called the internal labor market. And that is favorable for both workers and companies, because changing jobs is always costly. And if you can continue the relationship as long as possible, as long as it's beneficial for both, then that will be in the benefit of both in the long run, and will also contribute most to, let's say, a productive economy in which workers are really satisfied with the kind of jobs they have and are therefore not motivated primarily by financial incentives, by the fact that they like their work.
What about the collective dimension of that board in terms of trade union representation and determination and so on?
Yeah, well, of course, the opportunity to have some say about your work, to have voice, to be able to influence your work are also part of this. I think that too often it is just that people get more voice. Again, this is detrimental for the company or the employer, because he has to adjust to the wishes of their staff. But in the long run, it's better, of course, to adjust jobs, adjust positions, adjust tasks to what people prefer and what they can do, than simply say, well, you have as a worker to adjust to the job. In general, I think this is an important principle. People are more important than jobs. So it's much more important that jobs are adjusted to people instead of people being forced to adjust to the jobs.
Well, I'm always worried with Bo, when we think about the financial crash, that there were 2 companies involved in that episode where we were 2 really critical Lehman Brothers in America and the Royal Bank of Scotland in Britain. In both cases, they were led by individuals who very strongly believed in one-man management, and deferred in the case of Lehman Brothers, and Fred Goodwin in the case of Tobias. And it seemed that they're very single-minded pursuit of their own ideas without anybody else having a voice.
Yes.
Was critical to what ended up in the complete collapse of both organizations in the global financial crisis.
Yeah, I think that might be true. I'm not saying that employees always know better what's good for the company than management, but I think often workers, employees have good ideas about how the functioning of the organization could be improved, and they're simply not listened to. So if they could have a voice in that, and if their ideas would also play a role, I'm not saying they should be the bosses themselves, but if management would listen more to what the employees have for ideas, I think that would also be in the interest of the management and also of the shareholders of the company.
Well, final question for you, Paul. Just listening to what you say, I'm thinking that a lot of it is very counterintuitive, um, and as you say, even in the Nordic countries in recent times, there's been some regression from policies, labour market policies, which, as you say, seem to be very well evidenced and very well substantiated. If, as with Keynesian economics, if what you're advancing is counterintuitive, how do you get policymakers to articulate that? How do they find the language to put this across? How do they manage to win political arguments against those who would put the very orthodox, sort of common sense view that this really is all about workers and employers in endless negotiations as individuals with a price?
Yeah, that's a very hard question, and I'm afraid I don't have a real good answer to this. Of course, as a researcher, as a scientist, I hope that simply giving good arguments will also convince politicians and ultimately also the broader public of the fact that our idea of the labor market is often not the correct picture. And I admit that it simply doesn't work that way, and that people have some ideas which they have been told for so long a period that they won't change their ideas quite simply and in the short term. Nevertheless, we've seen such switches in opinion in the past, as we already discussed. The old idea of the welfare state and offering a lot of protection to workers was a popular idea and broadly supported during, let's say, the 1970s until perhaps the 1990s. And it changed after that. So if it can change in one direction, I think it might also be able to change in the other direction. But of course, you need strong opinion leaders who also voice that idea. And well, I hope to contribute a little bit to that change in view. But of course, I have not the illusion that my book will change thinking about labor markets overnight.
I suppose if we took your point, Paul, and we give the example of the Swedish welfare state, obviously that was articulated very strongly in the phrase the people's home, which initially was quite a conservative idea in Sweden, but it was appropriated by the Social Democrats to find a way of describing this idea of universal welfare state in terms that could be widely understood among the public and would resonate very widely. And I suppose the conclusions of what you're saying, if I'm not getting it wrong, is that you think the message in terms of labour market policy should be much more one like that of stability and security, rather than what you could say is associated with the third way language of the 1990s, which was all about workers adapting to globalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, of course, the funny thing is that if you ask ordinary people, most of them say they find security, stability very important. But apparently, they have come to believe that that is no longer possible. As we discussed, the whole idea of the 24/7 economy, of the impact of globalization, and so has apparently changed the conviction of many workers that old situation is no longer possible. So I hope to be able to show a little bit that the idea that the security and stability we had in the past is no longer possible, that should be a wrong idea. And many people experience also that many people work long time for the same employer. So they know that most people do not change jobs every year or something like that. But still, that story has been told over and over, and then for people start to believe something which they do not experience from their own, let's say, their own experience in their own job or something like that. So I think we should simply show people that their view on how things are working in companies, for example, that most people fortunately do have an endurable relationship with their employer, is not an idea of the past, but is still very well alive.
Many thanks. Paul reminded me of my Irish compatriot who famously spoke. He might have been talking about Orthodox market economists. He famously spoke of those who understand the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Yeah.
So many thanks for giving of your time and expertise today.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Paul de Beer. He's Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Amsterdam and author of The Labour Market Myth, published by Edward Elgar. Thank you and goodbye.